Thanks for everyone for joining us this evening. As part of our meeting agenda this evening is I'll do a brief introduction of our presenters as well as our panelists, and a summary and overview of our purpose for this evening as well as the project as a whole. Then we'll get into the main presentation itself, and then as Catherine mentioned, we will have a question and answer period at the end of this session. So please use the Q&A window to type in any questions you may have. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Evan Chen. I'm with the City of Barrie. I'm the project manager for this project. Joining me today as a presenter is also Pippi Warburton, our consultant project manager from AECOM Canada, Michael Gregory from Computational Hydraulics International, and Nancy Hill from AECOM Canada as well. As part of our committee, as part of our panelist group, we also have Craig Miller, our Director of Finance from the City of Barrie, as well as Jacob Reed, our Supervisor of Technical, Stormwater, and Rail Operations, also from City of Barrie. Next slide. So purpose and objective for today is we'll introduce the concept of stormwater management, what it is and why it's important. And we'll also briefly introduce what this project is about, why it's needed, and what's involved with this project with the Stormwater Climate Action Fund. And then we'll get into the bulk of the discussion where we'll go over the recommended funding models, the residential tier groupings, the estimated rates, and the credit review program framework. At the end, we'll close out the presentation with the overview of the upcoming tasks that the project team will be undertaking, as well as, again, a Q&A session at the very end. Next slide. So what exactly is Stormwater Climate Action Fund? Stormwater Climate Action Fund is to create a dedicated fund for the city's stormwater assets and associated stormwater management activities within the City of Barrie. And the overarching objective really is to improve the city's protection of the Lake Simcoe and environment, as well as improve the city's resilience against climate change, and apply a use-of-pay principle to stormwater funding so that it's more fair and equitable. Now, I also like to highlight the Ontario Regulation 588/17 in regards to asset management planning, where we need to have a strategy to fund those types of activities. So this project is in support of that regulation as well. Next slide. So we did have a public information meeting, number 1, back in June. And during that session, we had discussed what exactly is stormwater management, what are the city's stormwater infrastructure assets, and how the city is currently managing the spending of those stormwater services, and how that compares to other municipalities, what other municipalities are doing as well. We also discussed the recommended funding mechanism and model that came out of the part of the study that was completed in 2019 and shared with council, and all the various fee structure options that we took under consideration when we started developing this program. So we'll discuss a little bit more about that as we move on through the presentation. Next slide. So as we go through the presentation, a couple of key highlights I like to, discuss with the group here is that 1, stormwater adds pollutants to Lake Simcoe and the environment. And of course, with better stormwater management, this means there'll be a better water quality overall for the community as a whole. And currently the stormwater services are paid through existing property taxes. And again, the goal of this project is to be able to create a more fair and equitable way to fund those stormwater services. And that's again, using the use-of-pay principle to do so. Next slide. So like I mentioned, we held our first virtual public information meeting on June 3rd. We had a great turnout of 127 participants. We had a lot of questions that were asked at the end of that session as well. And those questions have been organized, summarized, and answered and have been posted on buildingbarrie.ca, along with the recording of the public information meeting presentation as well. So this information, like Catherine mentioned, this public information meeting is recorded and it will be posted on buildingbarrie.ca as well. Next slide. So after our first public information meeting, we sent out a survey to all the participants. And some of the key survey results are summarized here. I'm not going to go through every single one, but I will highlight that 81.6% of the respondents agreed that stormwater costs should be equitably distributed across the community. And 74.3% of respondents do agree that the recommended stormwater user fee based on impervious area is more fair and equitable. And of course, the vast majority of the respondents agree that we need to have some kind of credit or rebate program in conjunction with the stormwater fee program. Next slide. So additional feedback we have also received through the survey is to increase education about the impacts on impervious areas for new developments as well as existing properties. and also the importance of green development standards and how that leads into better environmental protection for Lake Simcoe, and how the city should be leading by example to modify its own properties. And again, the feedback we received was to have some kind of credit rebate mechanism in place along with the stormwater fee program. I'll now pass it over to Pippi to take us through the next few slides.
Thanks, Evan. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight. It's always great to see so many people taking the time to participate in these things, especially since we're all still online and can't meet in person. I have a few slides I'm going to speak to that we are sort of recapping some information that was presented at the PIC one. So bear with me if this is old news, but I just wanted to emphasize what stormwater is and what it isn't. So I think everyone knows stormwater is rainwater, melted snow, water that runs off our rooftops and driveways. So it's directly related to imperviousness, and that's a really big concept for this study when we talk about the fair and equitableness of stormwater funding studies. So the more impervious area, the more runoff. So the stormwater runs off the paved areas much faster than it would off grass or forest, where the water is delayed in its response or absorbed by the natural environment. So that's why we're relating a user pay system to impervious area. So it's different than wastewater, which is also a user pay system, and everyone's paying for their wastewater based on the meterage or the water that you drink. It's metered as it comes into your house, and it's proportional to the water that leaves your house. So you pay for wastewater, because that we can meter that. Well, we can't put a meter on stormwater. So instead, we directly relate it to the impervious area. So just to remind everybody that that's what we're talking about when we're talking about stormwater. Next slide. So Barrie is absolutely not unusual to all the municipalities that we've worked with in Ontario that have stormwater issues. You've got water quality. I mean, I think that would make Barrie somewhat unique, although lots of our Ontario communities are based on waterfront. Lake Simcoe is certainly a beautiful environment that's particularly precious and needs to be protected. And better stormwater means better water quality, which I think everyone agrees is very important. Climate change is definitely affecting water resources and stormwater directly. We're seeing peakier storms, more frequent storms. So climate change is exacerbating what we've already trying to deal with. There's insufficient capacity in some of the system in Barrie. And again, that's really not unusual. That's partly due to the fact that Barrie was built, over time, and there were different criteria and standards 50 years ago than there are today. There's been more development and that sort of thing. There's deteriorating infrastructure for sure. And that's a problem that all municipalities in Ontario face. It's hard to get money to upgrade infrastructure that people don't see. So unless there's, a culvert actually fails or your storm sewer fails in the area, people tend not to think about it very much. So that's definitely an issue. So there's some issues with deteriorating infrastructure. Barrie is a little bit unique in that it's a real development boom, as everybody I'm sure is aware. So as that increased impervious area comes decrease in water quality, and that means you need better stormwater management to make sure that the water quality stays good. So yeah, it's up to the development to bring that stormwater quality, and you have better criteria and guidelines now, and that they would have to adhere to. But eventually, it's still up to the city to maintain and keep up all the operations and maintenance of all of those stormwater facilities to make sure you keep your water quality in good repair. So a lot of that information is summarized in the Drainage Master Plan. It was done in 2019. It's available online if you want more details on that one. Next slide. So this is also something that we covered in the last public information session. So this hopefully isn't news to you, but the city recently finished their asset management plan, and some information just summarized here, which I think is a little bit eye-opening. Sometimes people realize the value of the assets that need to be maintained. So stormwater assets valuing close to $1 billion in the city of Barrie. It's a lot of money, and it's really to do due diligence to make sure that they're maintained properly, and that they'll last their full lifetime, and you don't end up with much more costly repairs of emergency repairs. So the estimated annual funding shortfall for stormwater right now is $11.7 million. That's according to your current asset management plan recently completed. Again, that asset management plan is available online if you want to review it or if you have any more questions about it. But it sort of summarizes everything from culverts, catch basins, ponds, oil grit separators, all of the components that make up the stormwater management system. And as Evan mentioned, we are also trying to comply with the Ontario regulation around asset management planning, which says that you need to have a sustainable funding mechanism. So I think the Ontario government has recognized that over time, there have been insufficient funds dedicated to maintaining assets in Ontario. And that's why we're seeing deteriorating assets that were built 50 to 100 years ago that haven't been maintained. So it's pushing municipalities to spend the correct amount of money to maintain the assets on behalf of their populations. Next slide. And I think that's where I'm handing it over to Nancy here. Thanks, Nancy.
Yeah, no problem. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, we've done some research into, okay, how should stormwater be funded at the City of Barrie? And we've looked at various stormwater funding models. And we've compared the city's existing stormwater funding model with what it would look like if it was to change and become an impervious based funding model. So currently, if you look at the pie chart on the top left, this is how the city currently funds stormwater through the property taxes, tax levy revenue. And residences contribute about 75% of that, and non-residential, so industrial, commercial, institutional, contribute about 25% of the revenue. So because stormwater is primarily funded through property taxes, that means residents contribute about 75% of the stormwater funding. Now, if we look at where does the imperviousness come from, so where are all the hard surfaces that generate the stormwater? Well, residents are only responsible for about 46% of the hard surfaces in the City of Barrie, 54%, whereas the non-residential, so the industrial, commercial, institutional is responsible for 46%. So you can see that even though the residential sector is only responsible for 54% of the stormwater generation, it pays for 75% of the funding. So if the City of Barrie was to decide to move to a different stormwater funding model that was based on impervious area, then residents would actually pay less towards stormwater for a given funding level. Next slide. So the City of Barrie has done some analysis around stormwater funding needs, and it has looked at existing funding needs as well as future funding needs. And so currently the city contributes about $10 million a year towards stormwater funding. And if it was to incrementally get from where it is to where ultimately it would need to be in the future, which is 45 million, which is a significant increase, well, how would it get there? So what we've done is we've identified a number of steps, a number of improvements, prioritize those improvements. So to get, if the city were to spend, for instance, $12 million a year, it would be able to clean out some of the detention ponds. Detention ponds are there to collect sediment and to clean the stormwater before it enters Lake Simcoe and other natural water courses, creeks that are within the City of Barrie. So for an extra $2 million a year, the city could help significantly the water quality entering Lake Simcoe and other water bodies, as well as better detain peak flows during storms. And then 22 million, and the next step up again, the city could be doing more maintenance on its existing system. It could replace deteriorating infrastructure. And so we've identified a number of steps for the City of Barrie to work incrementally towards the ultimate stormwater funding amount. Okay, next slide. So what we have done is we have recommended that the City of Barrie consider a stormwater funding model that is based on using impervious area. And for most of the properties in the city of Barrie by number are residential properties. So it would be fairly intensive to go out and measure every single property. So what we have said is for residential properties is to just use, just measure a few of them, which we've gone out and done, and come up with an average. So the average detached home, on average, it has this much impervious area. Condo, this much. Townhome, this much. And so you would, the resident would pay based on the average of their housing type. For non-residential properties, so that is industrial, commercial, institutional, we propose to actually go out and measure those. There are fewer of them, and they vary widely in terms of the amount of, whether they have a lot of parking, surface parking or not. Is it a big store? Is it a small store? And so we propose you actually, the city of Barrie would actually go out and measure those. And then we also have recommended that the city of Barrie provide credits and rebates to certain types of properties that would help them reduce their impact on the stormwater system, and would also, there's a little bit of financial incentive and recognition, and it would also reduce the fee for those properties. So, if you had a big box retail and they had a stormwater detention unit on their property, then they would get a reduction in their fee to recognize that. Stormwater user fees used to be new in Canada, but now there are probably 48, 10 years ago, we used to say they were quite new. There are now 48 stormwater user fees in Canada, many of which are based on imperviousness. And so this is something that's now being tried and, it's tried and tested in other municipalities, and the city of Barrie can take advantage and take the lessons learned from those other municipalities. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, residential properties, what we're proposing is that they're just based on the average for the type of property. So we've got the average detached home, and if we kind of say that's one unit, we say, well, what would we charge a semi-detached home or a duplex or a triplex or condo? And so we actually went out and did some statistical sampling. And what we found is that a duplex or a semi-detached home, they have about 70% of the imperviousness. And when I say 70%, I mean like a duplex, that's the half of the duplex of the average detached home. And then we found that triplexes and condos and townhomes have about 50%. And again, that's per unit of the average detached home. And we add up everything. We add the roof, the driveway, the sidewalk, the garage. And then we found for apartments, they have about 40%. And so the idea behind that is, for every, say, $1 that a detached home would pay, then half a duplex would pay, 70 cents, and an apartment would pay 40 cents. And that's the idea behind that. And again, it's statistical sampling. That's pretty, again, this is a tried and true method. And it recognizes that different residential housing forms have different levels of imperviousness. Okay, next slide. So if we did that, and so the idea behind that too is we would group like properties. So when I said, condos and townhomes have about 50%, then we say, okay, let's group them into one category just to simplify things and make things easier for administration purposes. And so we looked at what does the average home currently pay through the taxes to support the stormwater program. And these are averages, right? Because right now it's people pay based on assessed value. So we're taking the average assessed value. And we said, okay, well, what if we changed the funding towards an impervious-based model for the same funding level? So we're not increasing or decreasing the amount of stormwater funding. If we just simply picked it up, moved it from the property taxes and moved it over to a user fee system based on imperviousness, what they would pay. So we can see that for most residential units, so the average detached home, what we used to call a single family home, but in this we're calling a detached residential unit or a DRU, currently pays $174. Again, if we kept the stormwater funding level the same, I would only pay $129 under this new proposed system. And again, it's because of that impervious-based system where residents currently pay more than their share because it's funded through property taxes. Same with duplexes with a slight increase. Now that's based on a duplex, both units together. Condos, townhomes, those are they would pay individually because they're individually owned. So they would see a significant decrease. Apartments, and the numbers I have here are whole buildings. They would see a decrease, but who would see the increase? Obviously, not everyone can get a decreased amount, would be the non-residential sectors, so industrial, commercial, institutional. And again, this is based on the idea that you're not paying based on assessed value, you're paying based on your impervious area. And because the ICI sector has more impervious area than the residential sector, that's why they would pay more under this proposed funding model. Okay, next slide. And I'm passing it over to Mike Gregory.
Sure, I'll take this. One thing we didn't talk about at the first PIC, at least in any detail, was financial incentives. And so the idea is to, if someone provides stormwater management on their own property such that you don't directly, dispose of stormwater directly into the city system, then you qualify for a credit. You're relieving some of the burden on the city system. And so we call those on-site facilities. You see in quotes there in the second bullet. And I want to make an important distinction, just the terminology that we use, but you see the last group of bullets there. When we talk about financial incentives, there's really three different types. There are credits, and what a credit is, so on your bi-monthly or quarterly utility bill, whatever bill it's on, you would get a subsequent ongoing reduction for the facility that you have. So you have your base charge, then your credits, and your net charge that you would pay. So that's an ongoing reduced fee or fund, reduced charge. And then there's a rebate, which is very different, and that's a one-time thing. So if you have a qualifying facility, some municipalities would cut a check for a certain amount and say, here you go, you qualify for a rebate, there it is, don't apply again. And then there's subsidy. So it's reduced cost for materials, supplies, etc., providing assistance to help you install these things or purchase the materials for these things. Now, as Nancy mentioned, you saw a line item on one of her slides. There's 48 of these, almost 50 now in Canada, spread across 5 provinces. There's over 1,800 in the US. So in Canada, about a quarter of the stormwater user fees have credit programs credit programs. And of those 11 across Canada that we know of that have credit programs, only 3 of them offer credits to residential properties. The rest provide credits just to the non-residential properties and the multi-family residential properties. So the apartment buildings, the big properties with big footprints, big impervious footprints that generate a lot of runoff. And I'll explain the rationale behind that later on. Okay, next slide, please. So there's a great variety in the facilities that are eligible for credits and things like that. There's many photos on the screen. I'm not going to go through. I hope you recognize some of these things, hopefully in your own backyard. But what we're trying to do, or the function of these things, is to hold back the runoff, delay the runoff so that it can soak into the ground or be taken up by the roots of the vegetation, or provide some other beneficial use, rainwater harvesting, for example, where to serve a fountain or something that doesn't need drinking water. In any way, it fits in with other water conservation programs. So these are everything you see on the screen there are structural facilities. Most municipalities that have credit programs let you claim cumulative credits. So you can get credits for these facilities that you build that you invest in on your property, not just the structural things, but also the non-structural things, the education programs and things like that. So it's a combination. And many municipalities that have these credit programs, they also require certification that the facility, so the owner, if they've properly designed, installed, operated, maintained, then you qualify for the credit, and give the city staff the right to set up a time to inspect these things, to kind of confirm you're doing what you say you're doing. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, benefits of a financial program. Again, financial incentives program that could include a credit program, ongoing credits, or one-time rebates. And there's benefits all the way around. You can see that. Benefits to the property owner, to the city, and to the environment, ultimately. I don't know where that photo came from. I don't think it's Barrie, but I have to chuckle because it reminds me of the first time I saw one of these permeable pavement facilities. It was at, it doesn't matter where it was, but it was City of Calgary, their water services center. And of course, when you hear that it's permeable pavement, the natural instinct, of course, is to take whatever liquid is available at hand and test it out. And in my case, it was Timmy's coffee. I know it's a bit cliche, but so one of the disadvantages is that it could, permeable pavement, when people aren't familiar with it, could lead to higher caffeine loading downstream. Okay, but enough of that. And you can see all the benefits there. Next slide. Okay, these, there's many categories, great variety to the, not just the categories, but the amount of credit, the maximum credit that you can achieve in each of those categories. Even here in Ontario, in municipalities that are very close to each other, there's a great variety in the categories. And as you can see, it's hard to read this slide. But so the maximum credit is pretty standard, at least in Southern Ontario. And that's, you can claim up to 45, 50%. That's very common. And you see there in Guelph and in Mississauga, it's only the non-res properties and the multi-residential properties. And you see the very explicit definitions of what that means in terms of a stormwater user fee. In Mississauga, if you have more than a single unit, so more than a single family detached home, that's a multi-residential property that is eligible for a credit. In Guelph, no, it has to be a fiveplex, greater than a fiveplex, so 6 units or more, and then you can qualify for a credit. Otherwise, you can't qualify for a credit. You can qualify, in Guelph's case, you can qualify for a rebate. Kitchener does have a residential rebate program. But what's very interesting, you see the different categories there in the rightmost column. Is the category. So we call the first 2 bullets, we call those quantity control. So you can reduce the magnitude, so the peak flow that's coming out of your system or being disposed into the city system, the peak flow coming off your property. There's also an amount, so the runoff volume. Now, what's interesting is Guelph gives up to 15% credit for peak flow and up to 40% for volume reduction. Whereas in Mississauga, it's exact opposite. They give 40% for peak flow reduction, but only 15% for runoff volume reduction. And so every municipality is unique and has different needs, has different expenditures, et cetera. And so that's why they've ended up this way. And continuing on, there's water quality treatment. So not just quantity control, but quality control, and then the other non-structural things, the operations, activities, and things like that. And I must say too, that Mississauga is in, so Mississauga's, Kitchener's program has been in place for 10 years now, credit program and the user fee. Guelph has been in place for maybe 5 years, 6 years. Mississauga has also been in place for 5 or 6 years, and they are right now revisiting their credit program and looking at how their non-residential credit program is applied. And they're thinking of changing some of the categories and the percentages there. Okay, so I mentioned of the 48 user fees in Canada, only 3 of them offer credit programs for residential properties. Here in Ontario, it's Kitchener and Waterloo. Also, Victoria, BC does this. So they give credits, and it's based on how much volume you capture. So if you have a big rain barrel, you get a 20% credit on your monthly or bi-monthly bill in Kitchener or Waterloo. And the bigger the facility, the more volume you capture, the more credit you would get up to. Again, it's capped at 45%. And you see the list of facilities there that qualify. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are the preliminary recommendations for the financial incentives for Barrie, and it follows what's being done in most other municipalities, and that's to apply a credit program for the non-residential properties and the multi-residential properties, using probably the same, and we don't have this, we give a range there, and this is the typical range we see in Ontario, because we haven't looked at this in any detail yet. We're just going to make the recommendation what the program might look like, and then in a subsequent implementation phase, then we get into the exact details of what this is going to look like and the process for applying, etc. In any case, this is probably what it's going to look like. These are the recommendations from this phase of the study anyway. You see the credit categories and the wide range, and we probably favor, knowing what we know about how important it is to protect Lake Simcoe, we would probably favor at the higher end of the water quality treatment and the runoff volume reduction as well. You can get some water quality benefits by reducing the volume. So we probably favor the high end of the range you see, not so much with peak flow reduction. That doesn't do a lot for water quality treatment. And who knows where it'll end up with the non-structural education and operations credit. And again, following the lead of many other municipalities, certainly in Ontario, capping the maximum credit at 50% for a property. Okay, next slide. Okay, so again, the preliminary recommendations follow a lot of the work, and many of the team members on this, including staff at the city, were involved with other communities as they were developing these things. A lot of time and effort has gone into deciding what is the most appropriate financial incentive program for each of the municipalities, and certainly in Ontario. And we're probably going to follow a lot of what we learned from that, start there, and then make it unique to Barrie, what's going on here in Barrie. And so the common rationale for residential rebate programs, not credit programs, but rebate programs, is with a credit program, if you're going to get a 20% credit on $100 a year bill, let's say, in Kitchener's example, $100 is a typical average, you're saving $20 a year. It costs a lot more than $20 a year to actually enforce that, and to review the credit applications, to maybe randomly inspect a certain number per year, and just basically enforce the credit program. It's just not feasible. From the city's perspective, there's no payback from the city's perspective for that sort of thing. And so that's the first 2 bullets then for the residential credit program. The high cost of enforcing, administering that program. Now, the rationale is the bigger the facility, the more impact you can have on the city system if you treat stormwater on your property as opposed to disposing of it, like I said. And so the bigger the property, the more runoff that's involved, the more credit you can achieve, the more benefits the city will see by doing it. So that absolutely, we want to focus on those opportunities. And that's where enforcement administration of a credit program is in the city's best interest. And that's what we want to do. So as you see the last bullet there, the non-residential properties are much bigger, smaller in number and much bigger, and do have a significant impact. And so that's where we're heading with that. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say on that slide. Next slide, please. Oh, and Pippi, I get to turn this back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, so that's great. Thanks, Mike. That's a really good wrap up on the credit incentive programs. It's a lot to digest. So We're going to slow down for a second here, and we can see that there's quite a lot of questions coming in the Q&A box, which is great. We are working on summarizing those, and then we're heading them off to different people who will respond to your questions. So that's great. So if you have time and you have a question, you can get it into the Q&A box now. While we're doing that, we have anticipated some questions. So we've got some frequently asked questions that we're going to just go through right now while you guys are getting your Q&As in the Q&A box, and we're getting ready to answer those. So I've got 4 questions. So the first one that we often hear is this just going to raise my taxes? So the idea is no. What we're doing is we're shifting the way we fund stormwater from the way we exist under existing conditions. We fund stormwater through taxes. But your property taxes are based on the assessed value of your home. It has nothing to do with how much stormwater your property contributes to the system. So we're trying to make a more equitable system and have it based on proportionally based on how much impervious area you have. So we're shifting the funding from the taxes to this new utility. So if we stayed at the same level of funding, most single family units would see, single residential units would see actually a decrease, because right now the single residential units are actually paying too much proportionally to how much impervious area they have. So right now, the average detached home in Barrie is paying around $14.50 per month towards the stormwater program via the taxes. If we move just directly to a funding model based on impervious area and didn't increase the funding amount, that would go down to about $11 a month, so a decrease. Now that exact amount is still changing. We're still working on fine tuning what we're recommending. And we also haven't decided what funding level is appropriate yet. So to stay at the existing level, which we know is underfunding our system, to go all the way to the Cadillac, maybe in one go is too much. So we're trying to figure out how much we're going to increase the funding. So that's the short answer. It's not just going to raise your taxes. We're changing the way we're funding stormwater. Next slide. Will I get a credit for my rain barrel? I love rain barrels. Everybody loves rain barrels. I have 2 rain barrels in my garden. Nothing makes me happier than watering my garden with my rain barrels. I have goldfish in my rain barrels. But when it comes to stormwater, they are somewhat problematic. And there's two reasons why they're problematic. One is people don't manage them like a stormwater management pond. In order for them to actually soak up some of that stormwater, when a big storm hits, they need to be empty. And quite often they're full. So they're not actually providing a reduction in stormwater to the runoff from the system. So that's a problem. So they do reduce the amount of water you're using, which is great. But as we discussed at the beginning, the water that you drink and the wastewater is billed separately than stormwater. The second problem with rain barrels is the residential fee for stormwater is really quite small, like around $10 a month or less than $10 a month. So the amount it would cost to administer a rain barrel program credit is a lot. And, I think the administration cost of a stormwater fee program is something we have to be mindful of. So where are we going to get our most value for the taxpayers' money? How can we best, manage the system? So because you might only get sort of a couple dollars reduction in your fee, it's just it doesn't make it worthwhile for the amount of administration costs to administer a rain barrel credit program. So I think the city currently is leaning towards, for a residential credit program, for it to be a rebate program. So we would give you a rain barrel for super cheap or maybe free, or there might be incentive like a rebate program along those lines. So currently we're not thinking about a residential credit program, but for the commercial places, yes, that would make more sense, because they're going to be paying a lot more for the stormwater fee, because obviously they have more impervious area. So it makes more sense for them to be provided a credit program. Okay, next slide. Why can't the existing budget be reallocated to cover the cost of stormwater management? Well, that's a good question. And I think it's really sight unseen. So we see this a lot across Ontario, probably all the way around the world, that if the infrastructure is underground, people don't think about it. And there's, a new park, a new recreation center. There's a lot of asks on the municipal budgets. And so there's a lot of competition. So they just chronically get underfunded. So that's a problem. So having, taking it out of the budget cycle gives you a sustainable funding amount, and it's also more fair and equitable. So that's kind of the reason why we're taking it away from that. And again, the property tax, paying for your stormwater through property tax, we feel is unequitable, because that's based on your assessed value. So you can have $1 million home that might be all grassed and, beautifully landscaped and has very little runoff. And you could have a tiny little property that's all paved. And, so the assessed value has no relation to the amount of stormwater runoff. So there's that reason as well. One of the best things about having a user pay system is this credit program. So for the commercial industrial places, you can imagine that the current regulations and the guidelines for development says that if you're going to have a big commercial property, you do have to provide some stormwater management. So once they, go through the development application, they have to prove that they're, providing the correct amount of stormwater management. And that's all fine and good, but when it comes to maintaining it, it's very hard to incentivize them maintaining it. Whereas you can say now, if you show us proof that you've cleaned out your oil grit separator, or that you have cleaned the sediment out of your pond, we'll provide you, a credit on your program. So it gives it sort of incentivizes good stormwater management behavior in the commercial industrial sector. So that's a really good one too. So why don't we fund stormwater through the existing budget to cover the costs? I mean, those are some of the reasons. Next slide. Okay, how will impervious area, rooftops, impervious areas percentages be calculated? So Nancy talked a bit about this, and I would say that, we're looking at how do they say it? A statistically significant sampling of the different types of properties. So like single residential units, townhouses, apartments. And so we've actually looked at aerial photography, and we've actually measured a statistically significant number of each of those different types to come up with averages for each property type of residential units. So those are done by aerial photography, and we have actually gone in and lassoed the rooftop, the driveways, sidewalks, whatever is impervious area on those properties. We've come up with statistically significant averages, and that's what we're using for the residential properties. Now, commercial industrial properties there's just so much variance in them, and they could be giant, they can be small, they can be paved or not. So for commercial industrial properties, they will be measured individually. So we've done some averages to get some ideas of what it's going to look like. But going forward, if the town moves forward with this program, it would be, again, through aerial photography, and it would be measured individually. All the impervious areas will be calculated and added up. If people were have discrepancies about that, if they say, well, that's an old photograph and it's all changed now, no problem. Then we can go out and measure it on site, or we can get a more current photograph. There'll always be an opportunity to look at those on an individual basis. And again, the same thing, if you feel like you've been given a fee for like a single residential unit, but you're a townhouse, obviously you'd be able to just get that changed, and there'll be some leveling of those things once the program is rolled out, but relatively easy to manage. So that's how the impervious areas are measured. Okay, next slide. I think we're on to Q&A, right? Yep. So I'm going to, who's taking this one? Evan, back to Evan for this one. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pippi. So as far as the next steps for this project team, is that a recording of this presentation will be, again, like I mentioned, posted on buildingbarrie.ca, and a survey will be sent out to all the participants here today as well. So we'll be gathering feedback and comments as well as we start developing our final report and recommendations to council, which we're planning for November 15th. Additional communication, again, like we mentioned, will be done by buildingbarrie.ca as well as on barrie.ca. So keep a lookout on those web pages for any news update about the project. So I'll next slide, please. All right, so I think I'm going to pass this over to Catherine real quickly just to walk us through how the Q&A process is going to look like.
Yep. Hey, everyone, and thanks for the presentation so far. We're getting lots of good questions, so if you've already submitted some, that's great, and please keep them coming. As a reminder, it's just in the Q&A box that you should see on the bottom of your screen. So we are theming through your questions, and we'll just get started. The first one is, I believe, from Mike. So if you could speak a bit more about the uptake in some of the credit programs that you've seen in other municipalities.
Right. So yeah, the question was, what are you seeing for uptake in municipalities that have a credit program? And the answer is a lot less than expected. So typically, as you're planning, setting your rate for the next year, you would assume generally 5% or so of the total revenue would be not recognized as revenue. So it'd be given away as credits or rebates or things like that. So that's generally the rule of thumb, is set aside 5% of your revenue, assuming that'll go away to credits. The risk, of course, is that the uptake will be much greater. And if it is much greater, say 8 or 9 or 10%, you've got to make up that lost revenue by raising the rate for everyone else in the next year. So it's a very Kitchener, Mississauga spent a year, each of them spent a year just to figure out what makes the most sense in the initial billing and credit program. And again, refine that every year as you go. But anyway, the common thing we hear back anecdotally from other municipalities is that it's lower than expected, lower than 3%. In one case, I think it was 2% of the revenue. And so which leaves them scratching their heads. And in many cases, it's because they acknowledge they haven't spent enough time with educating the consumers, the users, and maybe just advertising and giving guidance and examples to help people fill out the credit applications and things like that. Now, recognizing that the municipalities I mentioned, Guelph and Kitchener, Waterloo, and Mississauga, they are looking at ways to increase the uptake to be more in line with what their expectation is. And to do that, it's very helpful in Kitchener's case to have nonprofit organizations to help with the education, for example, to give training and showcase what a rain garden, what a green roof, etc., what they look like and how they're operated, and giving assistance to the credit application. So to answer the question, there's not a lot of published data out there about the uptake, but it is typically lower than expected. And so I talked about ways that municipalities are trying to address that and increase the uptake to be more in line with their expectation.
Thanks, Mike. So we've got a lot of questions about ways that impervious areas can be reduced. So is the city looking at ways to reduce these impervious areas like roads, parking lots, and increase green infrastructure? And I think Nancy would be good to answer this question.
Yeah, there are a few things. One of the reasons why we recommended the funding model that recommended, because there are some other municipalities like Guelph where they have said, let's have every residential property pay the same. So whether you're a condo, whether you're a detached home, you all pay whatever it is, $110 a year, $10 a month, whatever it is. The reason we recommended this model, which actually recognizes you've got detached homes versus condos, apartments, they pay less, is it's a way of encouraging development towards higher density development. So for people who are in a condo, they pay less than someone in a detached home. And we saw that Barrie is undergoing growth. We saw that there was going to be growth in the future, and so that's why this funding model not only encourages but recognizes denser development. So that's kind of what we could do within this project to help encourage denser development. Two other things, there are some proposed new requirements from the province of Ontario to mandate municipalities better manage stormwater. So you treat storm, so you have to, the city has to infiltrate the first so many millimeters of rainfall. So if you've got a street, you actually have to design a system where you take, so either you reduce the width of the street, you introduce a rain garden, infiltration gallery, whatever it is to better manage it. They're just proposed requirements at this point, but if they do get passed, they will become law. And a lot of municipalities are preparing for that and developing requirements and starting to implement measures. On top of that, the city of Barrie has, in 2019, they developed the low impact development interim guidelines. So I know that, someone from the city of Barrie could probably better respond to this, but I know that they are doing a lot of work on implementing low impact development guidelines within development within the city of Barrie. I think hopefully that answers a lot of those questions, Catherine.
Thanks, Nancy. We also have a lot of questions about development charges and increased sprawl for development. So Craig, this would be a good question for you or someone from the city. Are there plans to make any changes to development charges, especially for developers that have large impervious areas, to help pay for the stormwater program? And could you speak more generally to these types of developments that are still taking place?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So great question. I think it's important for everyone to realize that development charges are governed by the Development Charges Act from the province of Ontario. So that determines what costs you can and cannot include. I can tell you that there is substantial costs in our development charges charge right now. So developers for new development, they are paying quite a bit. Again, that money is used to build the new infrastructure for new communities that are being built. So it's the expression that growth pays for growth. That's the concept. Once those communities are built and new residents move in, then the city takes ownership of those assets, and then it's the responsibility of the city to maintain them. So high level, quick answer to that question is we do collect development charges for new growth related infrastructure. I think it's back over to you, Catherine.
And you may want to stay on. I think I've got another question for you about Barrie's building code. There's a question of whether it's been amended so that new development going forward can mandate the inclusion of green infrastructure. And I think you probably touched on it, but is there anything else that you want to add?
No, I think, Catherine, we don't have our building code expert online unless Nancy wants to jump in. I was going to say we will post an answer to that question on our website unless Nancy has anything she wants to add. Or
yeah, most of those measures are covered, not necessarily in the building code, but the city of Barrie does have their storm drainage and stormwater management policies and design standards. And so they do have requirements in there around water balance, protecting wetlands, roof leader disconnection, a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of green infrastructure. I'm just looking at it now. In there, they got rainfall harvesting, permeable pavements, parking lot storage, rooftop storage. So that is all infiltration trenches, soak away pits, all these great things are within the city of Barrie storm drainage and stormwater management policies and design guidelines. And so that would dictate it. There might be a couple of things that would fall under the building code, but most of it would fall under that.
Thanks, Nancy. Okay, Pippi, there's a question for you here. Can you speak to the responsibility or the choices that a homeowner makes? And, it could be if they've decided to not buy a home in a floodplain, is there some kind of financial incentive for making those choices? Or let's say they've bought a property or already have an existing property that may be in a flood risk area. How do those choices affect homeowners?
Mm-hmm. Okay, a couple points I would raise to that. First of all, no one should be building in a floodplain. There's criteria and guidelines and measures that prohibit, like zoning bylaws that prohibit people building in a floodplain. But it's definitely true that some areas flood more than others, or some areas have flooding problems that others don't. And I would suggest that if you live in an area that doesn't have flooding problems, it's because you're serviced by a good stormwater management program. And therefore you should be, that everyone needs to pay accordingly. So, people who are living in an area that does have a flooding problem often are much more interested in how the stormwater program is being managed. But remember, if you're living in an area that's not flooding, it's because you have a good stormwater management system that needs to be maintained and cleaned and planned for. So I guess that's my answer to that one. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. Evan, there's a few questions about mapping. Does the city have public flood risk maps? And I'll let you answer that, but I have another follow-up map question. Sure.
So I guess the best place to start would be our stormwater asset management plan, and also with our capital asset management plan, team. So the stormwater capital asset management plan is linked on our buildingbarrie.ca webpage. So if you go there, you will be able to link to the stormwater asset management plan, which will give you more information about the flooding in Barrie. If you do need more information, please, you can also reach out to Service Barrie, and they'll be able to direct you to the right department to get you the information that you need.
Thanks, Evan. And is that the same type of information? Someone asked specifically about flooding in Barrie since 2000, the year 2000?
I can't speak if it's stormwater asset management plan have the data since 2000 per se in the report itself, but again, it's similar. Yeah, you can submit that kind of question to Service Barrie, and they'll try to do their best to try to get the answer for you.
Thanks, Evan.
No problem.
We have a few questions about the official plan. So one was asking why this work wasn't part of the initial official plan related to density options that were chosen. And a follow-up question to that is, how can we make it part of the official plan? And I think just generally answering where the disconnect is there. So Nancy, Craig.
Well, I think that where the connection is that we took a look at what the city of Barrie might look like in terms of future development. And because we thought there was going to be a lot of future development and we wanted to encourage denser development, so that the connect is that we are proposing a funding model that does encourage denser form of development. And so we're trying to support that. So I think that's the main connection there. And if and when the fee is implemented, then developers will see that, and hopefully that will influence their decision making.
Yeah, and maybe I just jump on, Nancy. I think it's important to kind of also remember it's one of the objectives here is to make it a fair and equitable system. And as one of the slides in the presentation highlighted, right now, the residential is paying a very large portion of the cost today on your property taxes. Right now, if we go to a user fee system like this, it'll make it a more fair and equitable in that the users will end up paying a greater share of it.
Thanks, Craig. Okay, I'm just going through the rest of the questions that we have here. Mike, there's a question about the administration fees related to a rain barrel program versus administering the new infrastructure model. Can you speak to the differences between the two?
The differences being in terms of the ineffectiveness of one versus the other? Is that the context?
Yeah, so in terms of if we're saying that it is costly to administer a rain barrel program compared to the cost of administering a new fee.
So I don't mean costly in terms of absolute cost, but it's effectiveness. It's more cost effective to focus your efforts on the non-residential credit program. It's not any cheaper to administrate, but the ideal situation is if all of the credits that were uptake, I can't think of the verb form of that, but if you were to install all of these on-site facilities, there would be a dollar amount savings on an average annual basis to the city. And you would take that average annual savings and translate that back into credits in a fair and equitable way. Let me come back to that. But I will say, when City of Kitchener was developing their back in 2010, actually, before they implemented their user fee, they had a tagline to their program. And it was, the more you pave, P-A-V-E, the more you pay. The more you pave, the more you pay. That was the tagline to help explain in simple terms what this user fee was all about. Well, the corollary to that is, with a credit program, the more you store, the more you save. And so again, it works both ways. This is a savings realized by the city. Now they don't have to treat this much. So again, if you look at the total cost savings to the city for implementing all these on-site facilities, you would translate ideally back into a credit. With that one rain barrel, that probably saves $20 on an average annual basis, so give $20 credit. Whereas a automated rainwater harvesting system at a large shopping center or permeable pavements at a shopping center could save thousands of dollars to the city. So it's not, so it does cost more to administrate that program, but it's more cost effective to incentivize that sort of activity. I hope that is a satisfying answer to the person that asked.
Thanks, Mike. And while you're here,
Yep.
do you have anything to add in terms of a credit for more tree planting?
Tree planting. Yes. So there's no doubt that a mature tree with a large canopy, deciduous tree, not pines or things like that, but that will intercept more runoff. It will generally lead to less runoff. Now, if you plant it in a pervious area, I don't know if that's going to do anything, because the base charge is based on impervious area. The thing is to collect rain runoff from parking areas, rooftops, and then discharge that onto the pervious area that has these big trees with the roots that'll draw the water. Yes, that is a creditable, in some communities. I haven't seen this a lot in Ontario. It is a credit-worthy activity. It's generally a rebate type thing for if you have large mature trees of a certain diameter, etc., or canopy footprint. Then yes, that. So I would like to see that. Absolutely. I'd like to see more of that here in Ontario.
Thanks, Mike. We have a comment from someone that it seems as though there isn't much of a financial incentive for individual homeowners to utilize stormwater friendly practices if they are being categorized with other similar homeowners with the flat fee. Does anyone have a response to this comment?
Yeah, I mean, Mike and I would probably say the same thing. So the alternative to do that, if we really wanted to measure it, is to measure every single property. And we considered that, and there is one municipality that does that. Yeah, I think I can't remember the number, but I think it's something like 80% of the properties are in the city of Barrie are residential. So the cost to set up and administer this program, so that you could count the impervious area of each individual property, would be significant. So that would greatly increase the cost of this new funding model. So again, it's a decision point. If you wanted to make it absolutely equitable, yes, you would do that. There would be a cost to that. And so what we found is the variability, and we looked at this, the variability between different residential properties isn't great. So the benefit to measuring individual residential properties isn't significant enough to justify the extra cost. Whereas in non-residential properties, the variability between the amount of impervious area is significant, and there are much fewer properties. So you say, okay, you're getting more bang for your buck if you put your time into measuring the imperviousness of non-residential properties. Having said that, by offering rebates, for instance, you could, and some municipalities have gone further and offered credits to residential properties to encourage on-site stormwater systems in residential properties that reduce stormwater runoff. So yeah, so you could either, yeah, you've got sort of bunch of options. Either you measure every single residential property, which very few municipalities do, or you offer a credit program residential properties, or you offer a rebate program and to encourage better stormwater management on private properties.
Thanks, Nancy. Nancy, if you want to stay on the line here. So there's a question about historic neighborhoods and those neighborhoods having more trees. Was there any consideration given to having another category to fit that type of neighborhood?
Yeah, we've actually looked at that for quite a few, because we've done these studies for quite a few municipalities, and we actually looked at that quite a bit. And particularly for municipalities that have sort of semi-urban or rural areas, because they do have large properties that are very green. And the reason we came back to that is, even though those properties don't necessarily produce lots of stormwater, because the properties are so large, you actually have to build a lot of infrastructure. So if you think, if you've got, if it's a ditch system, you've got a ditch, or if it's a sewer system, you've got a storm sewer that goes past. So it's got to get past that large property to get to the next property to pick up its stormwater runoff. And so we actually found that these areas with larger green properties actually cost the city more in fixed costs, because the properties are so large that they have to build that infrastructure to service those large properties. So yeah, so none of it. So having said that, in some of the areas, and for instance, these large rural properties, municipalities have decided to give those people a discount purely on political grounds. There was no justification in terms of cost savings, but that's why we didn't consider it here larger historical neighborhoods, because those large properties actually do cost a fair bit of money to service, because they need extra length of infrastructure.
Thanks, Nancy. Pippi, I've got a question for you. I know we talked a little bit about taxes earlier in the presentation, but there's a question about whether taxes will just be increased, and more generally, how is this an advantage to the regular homeowner?
Yeah. So this is a question and a sentiment we get quite a bit, and I'm just reading the question in detail. And definitely, as a homeowner, you get lots of different bills from lots of different sources, and this seems like we're just taking money from one pile and putting it in a different pile, and sort of what's the advantage? How is this helpful? So a couple of points. Like, first of all, the study that we're doing now is a one-time cost. So in the future, it's going to save lots of administration costs in the future. Taking the stormwater fund off your taxes and putting it on a fund like this is going to eventually be cheaper, because it's chronically so underfunded on the tax system, because it often doesn't get the amount of funding that it needs. And it ends up with these sort of big failures that actually cost a lot more. So that expression, a stitch in time saves nine. So if you actually can get to a point where the assets are managed properly and you have a good maintenance and operation plan, the taxpayers are going to end up paying less, eventually for that system, because you're not paying for those big catastrophic failures, right? So I would say that's one advantage to the taxpayer by taking it off the taxes and putting it onto this user system. The advantage for you personally is the city is going to be able to better manage the stormwater program with sustainable, consistent funding. So like I said, less likely to have more expensive, costly, catastrophic failures, because the system's managed properly. Better stormwater management means better water quality in the environment, and I think that's an advantage as well. So yeah, I know it seems like we're just changing the cup that the money is coming out of. But I think there are some genuine advantages, and they're a little nuanced, but I'm hoping that I've answered your question there. I'm just reading your question again to make sure I've got all of it. So,
and I think, Pippi, also the idea is, does the money come off the taxes is what they were suggesting. Do the taxes still stay high? And on top of that, you pay a stormwater fee. And really that's a question for council. So the engineering department will say, okay, we're no longer being funded from the property tax bill. And then it's up to council to say, okay, what do we then do with this tax, with these taxes? Do we then reduce the taxes accordingly? And unfortunately, we don't make those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just jump on there though? What the recommendation and as we go forward with this exercise is that it will come off the property taxes moved over to this fee. So the concept is there's less pressure on your property taxes to pay for this program. So if we keep it at the same level we're spending today, which, while not adequate to maintain our assets at this point in time, but if we start from there, if council approves it, you would see for this particular service a reduction in the cost on your property taxes overall net compared to the new fee. But as Pippi and Nancy highlighted, it'll ultimately be council's decision. And then over the long term, as Pippi described, there would be substantial savings in that the city will be better positioned to manage the assets. If we keep doing what we're doing now, there's going to be some really expensive capital costs in the near future, and that would definitely have an impact on future taxes.
Thanks, Nancy, Craig, and Pippi. Pippi, if you want to stay on, I've got another question for you. So if the overall, and maybe confirm if this isn't the actual intention, is to reduce stormwater flow, and if there's less than a 3% uptake by commercial, industrial, institutional users in other municipalities implementing green infrastructure, how does that help with that reduction in flow overall?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the reduction in flow would be a nice benefit from the program, but that's not the main purpose of the program. Is to find a sustainable funding of the overall program, a sustainable funding source of the overall program. We certainly wish there was more update on the credit program. That would be great. But keep in mind, when we're moving to this sort of user pay system, there's larger properties that have a lot of impervious area are not going to be happy. All of a sudden, they're going to be the ones paying more. So to be able to say, well, there is something you could do about it. You have the choice. You can, reduce the runoff from your property. We have to, I think, provide them that option. And if they choose to just pay the amount, and therefore we can, support our stormwater system with that money, then it's either or sort of thing. So yeah, it's unfortunate that we don't get a reduction in flows. That would be great. If you have any suggestions on how we could better incentivize that, that would be great. Yeah, so the main purpose of the project is to find a sustainable funding source. So we're giving them the option to reduce their fee if they want to. But yeah, it is unfortunate that we have seen low uptake on that. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Pippi. And I believe this is the last question that we got in. So if we could go to slide 15, I believe it's the slide with the pie chart. And Nancy or Pippi, you're welcome to answer this one. So the comment really is looking to summarize what we are talking about. So it's just confirming that the program means that those who contribute most to stormwater, like the big box stores, large parking lots, development sprawl, they have to pay their share to help the city financially manage these costs. So just looking for a confirmation that yeah,
that's exactly it. That's a great question. That's exactly it. That's the whole essence of this, and you've summarized it beautifully in that question. So those who create more runoff pay more. Yeah.
Okay, and I see a couple of questions came in just as we were saying that. So there's a question about stormwater ponds. And
yeah, I can answer that one.
Like,
yeah.
Sure. So it sounds like the question is about ponds in the United States for large properties.
Yeah, I can summarize that question. So yeah, just
Sure.
talking about the way stormwater is handled in general. I think the question is sort of talking about these, you know, sometimes people don't notice stormwater management, and then, you know, you've obviously been at a truck stop or one of these en routes or something perhaps, and you see a stormwater management pond at the side, a lot of times in industrial areas. So rightly so, you're pointing out that these trucking facilities or factories, they have these large areas letting the rainwater flow directly into the water facilities and factories where evaporation can occur. So yeah, these settling facilities. So Barrie has lots of them. Barrie has stormwater management facilities all over the city where the water comes into the pond and it settles. So as the sediment drops out, and the pond can fill up, and then it releases at a slower rate so it doesn't overwhelm the system. So that's basically how stormwater management facilities work. And in Ontario, they're legislated. You have to have stormwater management facilities in certain cases and scenarios. They're there to protect the downstream properties from flooding and like from the sewer system from being overwhelmed. And they're also there to provide water quality, so that contaminated sediment drops out and then has to be cleaned out periodically. I think you're mentioning liners and making sure that you don't get that contaminated water into the groundwater. So yeah, those kind of studies are always done. We have geotechnical investigations when a pond is created, and we determine whether it's in a source water protection area, what the soils are like, if they would infiltrate too much and that sort of thing. So we have some ponds have clay liners or textile liners to make sure that the contaminants don't permeate into the groundwater for sure. So not a question, checking if this is in the works to implement such a method similar to the United States. So I think the answer is yes, that's a common stormwater management practice. And Evan, do you happen to know the number of stormwater management facility ponds that we have, or settling basins, some people call them? How many do you have in Barrie? Or maybe Nancy, you know the number of ponds we have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Jacob, how many? I have 80 in my head, but I don't even know. But it's dozens.
Yeah, lots.
There's definitely lots. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head either. Yeah.
I can jump in here. So we have no problem. We have 95 stormwater management facilities in the city. Approximately 55 are wet ponds, meaning that they hold water. And the remainder of them are dry facilities. And typically those are just meant to hold or store the water during heavy rains.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone. I think that closes it for the questions. Thanks so much for all of your great input. And before I pass it off to Evan for some final remarks, if you have anything that you'd like to share, just wanted to remind folks that there is a survey on the Building Barrie webpage, and that will be open for the next 2 weeks. So we will send out an email to everyone with a link to all of that information. But Evan, any closing remarks from you?
Just to echo what you said, thank you very much for everybody joining us this evening. Thank you for all the great questions. And like Catherine said, we will be sending out a survey link. And like I mentioned earlier, we will be posting a recording of this presentation on buildingbarrie.ca. And if you haven't subscribed already, please click on that subscribe box and you can get more information from our communications group. And if you do think of any questions afterwards, the survey is not your only opportunity for engagement. You can reach out to the project team as well and submit questions via buildingbarrie.ca directly as well. So we'll get to as many as we can. And again, just thank you everybody for joining us this evening.
Hey, thanks everyone and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.